Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. I just want to invite everyone to add questions to the Q&A, and at the end of our discussion, we'll have a conversation and answer some of your questions. The gallery holdings of works on paper ranges in date from the 15th to the 21st century and includes works from across the world. The collection is accessible to the public by appointment in the James E. Duffy Study Room for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs. But beginning this past winter, we opened the James Duffy Gallery that I'm showing you here. It's adjacent to the study room on the 4th floor of the Kahn Building, and it's envisioned as an extension of the study room, broadening our audiences and the spaces for conversation about works on paper. A selection of prints and drawings will be presented in thematic installations that will rotate every 6 months and present a wide range of topics. I just want to take a moment now to celebrate the generosity of James Duffy, who recently passed. We'll be speaking today about our first rotation entitled Sets, Series, and Composite Prints. This rotation demonstrates how since the advent of printmaking in Europe in the mid-15th century, prints have been created in sets, series, and in combination to document and classify, relate narratives or histories, or present multiple musings on a single theme. They also serve a larger purpose, widely disseminating content with the intent to uplift and educate, and sometimes call to action. Ranging in date from the 16th to the 21st century, these sets, series, and composite prints from the permanent collection represent the breadth and complexity of serial approaches to the presentation of scientific, historical, cartographic, and psychological knowledge. Next slide, please. Today, I'm going to be talking about two groupings of landscapes, one by the 17th century Dutch master, Rembrandt van Rijn, and the other by the contemporary artist, German artist, George Baselitz. Next slide, please. At the peak of his popularity as a painter and printmaker of portraits and history subjects, Rembrandt created 27 landscape etchings. For just over a decade, between 1640 and 1653, Rembrandt devoted himself to drawing and etching landscapes on paper. The prints were not conceived as a traditional series, as they are all different sizes and executed over an extended period, but they are all based on observations of the marshy Dutch countryside in and around Rembrandt's home in Amsterdam. The etchings are similar in that they are all populated by windmills, farmlands, and cottages. Many of the Dutch artists who created landscapes during Rembrandt's time were specialists of the subject, creating numerous sets and series for a growing market. Rembrandt depends on this tradition, but remains an outlier. Records show that these works and similar drawn landscapes were made out of doors or en plein air as Rembrandt wandered in his local environs around the capital. These etched landscapes, however, combine Rembrandt's lived reality with his imaginings of an old-fashioned Dutch idyll. He etched swiftly executed works that give the impression of having been done in nature, and highly elaborate landscapes that must have been composed and executed in his studio from drawings that were made on the spot. He subordinated topographical accuracy for views that pleased the eye. These characteristic Dutch motifs may have sparked patriotism in his audience as the long 80 Years' War, or the Dutch War of Independence, was winding down between the 17 provinces of what are now the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg against King Philip II of Spain, the sovereign of the Habsburg Netherlands. In letters to his patron, Rembrandt noted that he was trying to achieve the greatest and most natural expression in his works. Next slide, please. He did this by using and often combining several techniques of printmaking, including etching, engraving, and the audacious technique of dry point, where the artist scratches directly into the copper plate with a sharp tool, throwing off tiny shards of metal to create lines and fuzzy shadows. Rembrandt is known by specialists as the experimental etcher. He enjoyed trying new things, adding lines, figures, background, as well as erasing whole parts of a composition, creating different states or variations of an image. He even experimented with different inks and papers. In this amazing detail of landscape with three gabled cottages beside a road, we see his third attempt at this landscape. The finesse of the webs of thousands of etched lines, the close parallels and cross-hatching that evoke texture and dimension, and the slight branches and foliage that are carved into the copper by the dry point needle that catch ink and generate shadows. Rembrandt was appealing to a market of connoisseurs and collectors, as well as a broad public. His prints are highly wrought and meant to be read closely, seen intimately, held and beheld. Next slide, please. Baselitz also works in the medium of etching, but rather than the carefully composed landscapes of Rembrandt, the detail on the right from one of his sheets in the series entitled A Week reveals Baselitz's aggressive, seemingly spontaneous, flamboyant lines. He also works at a larger scale. His prints are a little over twice the size of Rembrandt's, and the series as a whole was meant to be viewed together on a wall. Both Rembrandt and Baselitz are virtuosic experimental printmakers. Next slide, please. And this series by Baselitz depends on the same artistic tradition of landscape. But like Rembrandt's, Baselitz's are also exceptional. Each of the 7 sheets, and here I'm showing you 4, represent houses or fragments of them surrounded by trees, fields, and rural byways. The series takes the viewer through time, a full week, but the passage of time is not marked, rather the movement between different spaces and perspectives. As a German artist working in the wake of World War II, in a nation divided by conflict and destroyed by war, Baselitz sought a new perspective to his art making. The series isn't purely abstract or figural, though he does include recognizable architecture and settings. They can be understood as landscape in the simplest sense, but he inverts the compositions, literally turns the composition on its head. He upends tradition, breaks through our normal thought processes. He makes the motif the background and its forms moving and connecting like tentacles so that the eye moves across the surface, recognizes the ferocity of the lines that intersect, amass, and fracture. There's visual power in his unadulterated gestures, but meaning as a whole is lost or questioned. The world is upside down. And on that happy note, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, our Selden Fellow, Isabel Saygraves. Thank you.
Thank you, Freda. As we have seen in Baselitz's work, constrained timeframes such as a week can give a sense of structure to longer sets and series. The first work I am going to be speaking about today is Elle by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. And it also uses time as an overarching structure, as it takes place over the course of one day in an unidentified Parisian brothel. Elle, which is translated imperfectly to them or those women, comprises 10 color lithographs plus a frontispiece, and we selected 4 prints to include in our rotation. Toulouse-Lautrec created this series after living in several brothels in the Montmartre neighborhood of Paris for extended periods in the early 1890s, a time during which he was both a customer and a lodger. By his account, he befriended many of the women with whom he lived, often sharing meals with them and engaging in daily activities. However, the fact that he also patronized these brothels and was a client as well as an observer complicates his relationship to the women that he's portraying, as well as the images he produces. By the time he created this series in 1896, Toulouse-Lautrec was an accomplished printmaker. He began his forays into color lithography with large-scale advertising posters for Parisian nightlife, which had the specific goal of selling both a product, usually an experience or a performance at a particular nightclub, as well as Lautrec's own distinctive style as a designer. However, Lautrec did not subscribe to contemporary divisions of printmaking into 2 camps, sort of commercial and artistic. And he worked seamlessly between these 2 genres, these larger poster formats, and then the smaller, more intimate portfolios such as Elle. The impetus in for Elle was due in part to the increased popularity in the mid-1890s for these kinds of limited run lithographic portfolios, usually for individual collectors, many of which were printed by the infamous professional printer Auguste Clos, who likely worked on Elle. Clos and Lautrec would have worked closely together in the production of these lithographs, using one lithographic stone for each color that you're seeing. As we will see as we go through the series, there are several contrasting techniques at play here. Some are single color lithographs, which use one color and mimic the effects of drawing, while others layer multiple bright colors together and come closer to the graphic style found in his posters. The series begins with a frontispiece that depicts the figure of an unidentifiable woman with her back turned to the viewer, adjusting her hair. On the left, a top hat suggests the presence of a male client, but he's not explicitly shown. The rest of the prints have an order, although they're not numbered, and they are deliberately episodic, as if we are catching a glimpse of one character or another and then moving into a different room. On the right of the screen here is the first print in the series, in which the famous clown Mademoiselle Chow Kao sits with an ambiguous expression, perhaps resigned, perhaps bored, perhaps slightly amused. This is probably the only print that takes place in a public cafe and not the private quarters of the brothel. In the next two prints, Toulouse-Lautrec only uses one color, creating spare compositions that seem fleeting or ethereal, perhaps trying to capture the feeling of just waking up. Here we are introduced in the left image to Mademoiselle Popo and her mother, Juliette Baron, both friends of Lautrec. In Women at a Tub, Toulouse-Lautrec returns to full color as a woman, probably the same figure from the frontispiece, prepares to wash. On the mantle, a male bust sits atop a clock, which reads 10 o'clock, giving the viewer their first concrete introduction into the temporal structure that Lautrec is employing. The next three prints are images of the toilette. In each, a semi-clothed figure turns away from the viewer as she prepares herself for her day. Lautrec then gives us, in quick succession, another image of Madame Baron rousing her daughter from bed, and then his only actual image of the male client. Here, the caricatural male figure is placed in the margin of the composition and is made diminutive to the standing woman. Finally, the series concludes with an exhausted figure collapsing into bed. When the series was first published, it was a commercial failure, likely because it did not include the scenes of sexual fantasy that was expected of its subject matter. Many of Toulouse-Lautrec's contemporaries, such as Edouard Manet or Edgar Degas, focus primarily in their work on the encounter between client and prostitute, either explicitly through their composition or implicitly through a staged encounter between the prostitute as subject and the viewer. In Elle, Lautrec chose instead to make the male figure marginal and instead emphasize the mundane everyday activities of these women. They wake up, they eat breakfast, they wash, they prepare themselves for work. The fantasy of the brothel is made less important than its everyday reality. By foregrounding the private domestic routines of women, the Elle series has a lot in common with the contemporary work of Mary Cassatt and Britt Morisot, two other artists working in Paris during this period. Toulouse-Lautrec would have undoubtedly seen the exhibition of Cassatt's series of 10 color prints, which she created in 1891, one of which is shown here in the center. Cassatt and Morisot's women occupy upper-class private interiors, but the intimacy and sensitivity with which they render their private moments likely inspired elements of Elle. It's been argued by many scholars that women such as Cassatt and Morisot use domestic spaces as substitutes for the sites of urban modern life, like the brothel, that they were not permitted to enter and paint due to the combination of their class and their gender. However, it's interesting to consider here, instead, in the Elle series, Lautrec is probably looking to their renderings of a more bourgeois version of domesticity in order to emphasize the everydayness of the routines of the women in the brothels. Interestingly, Lautrec changed the title of the series from La Fille, which was a contemporary slang term referring directly to prostitution, to Elle, a more general term that could refer to a much broader group of women. However, these works do not depict all women, and especially when we consider the fact that Toulouse-Lautrec was also a client of these women as well as their friend, it's clear that a voyeuristic sort of gaze persists, even if it's less pronounced than perhaps in the work by Toulouse-Lautrec's other contemporaries, such as Degas. The bed, a site of both rest and of labor, is almost always present in the images, even in those like Women at the Tub, which foreground domestic chores. While in some works, Lautrec makes the individual identities and expressions of the women apparent, such as in his print of Mademoiselle Chow Kao or Mademoiselle Popo and her mother, many of the figures, and particularly the ones which are partially undressed, remain faceless, with their back turned to the viewer, making our looking feel like some sort of an intrusion. So while Lautrec is most interested in showing scenes from modern life, the series A Glove by Max Klinger starts within a recognizable modern world, but then quickly jettisons reality altogether as Klinger submerges the viewer entirely within a fantasy dream world, sparked by his momentary interaction with a mysterious woman. Max Klinger was born in Leipzig in Germany in 1857 and studied in Karlsruhe before settling in Berlin. Klinger carefully studied the prints of both Rembrandt and perhaps more influentially Francisco Goya while he was in school. Goya's hallmark was the mixture of the fantastical with the recognizable, rendered in etching and aquatint, and these are elements that are particularly characteristic of Klinger's work as well. A Glove was based on a series of ink drawings first exhibited by Klinger in 1878 to great acclaim, despite the fact that the artist was only 21 years old. Klinger then transformed these drawings with a few modifications into printed etchings in the early 1880s. While Klinger also worked in painting and sculpture, he commented that drawings and prints were the most well-suited media to depict the world of fantasy, since their linear qualities meant they could be less complete, look less like reality, and thus be more suggestive of the imagination. He anticipated an interaction between the print and the viewer that would produce certain psychological effects. As such, he gave each print an individual one-word title that works alongside the prints to draw out certain emotional responses. At the outset, A Glove appears to be a straightforward narrative series that follows a male figure, typically considered a stand-in for Klinger himself, who watches a woman drop a glove in a skating rink. Even in these first prints, which are squarely within the modern world, Klinger begins to pull the viewer off balance. He exaggerates the angles of the skaters, who appear as though they could topple at any moment. Soon, however, we leave modern life behind and descend into Klinger's dream world as the glove becomes a kind of fetish object within the artist's mind. This transition is illustrated in this third print, Yearnings, where the despairing subject sits in bed with the glove in front of a landscape scene that could plausibly be a decorative panel or the beginnings of an imaginary world. He is then transported into a storming ocean where the glove begins to descend beneath the surface. The ocean setting is maintained for 3 more prints, but the glove here takes on a life of its own, shifting in both scale and setting. In Triumph, the glove becomes a kind of Venus figure, driving a chariot as it emerges from the sea, but by anxieties, it is multiplied into a terrifyingly nightmarish monster. Throughout the series, Klinger uses such contrast to create a tumultuous and disjointed narrative that barely holds any sense of unity aside from the figure of the glove itself. The glove oscillates between subject and object, building and deflating suspense as the narrative progresses. For example, the glove in the 8th print, Repose, rests passively on the table in front of a series of decorative giant gloves, but in Abduction, there's an explosive, violent moment in which a pterodactyl-like monster steals the glove. It's perhaps a surprise to us today that the series predated the writings of Freud, since it's concerned with such similar themes as those which Freud will pick up in, for example, The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. To show his movement deeper into the subconscious, Klinger uses the image of the ocean, which is an analogy that Freud also uses to explain much of his theory. The psychological intensity of the nightmare is its defining feature, and it's important that the series ends within the dream world in which the artist figure has completely disappeared. Despite the use of the term cycle to describe his narratives, Klinger does not return the viewer to where he or she started, and they're left stranded within Klinger's psychological fantasy. I will now turn over to my colleague, Lisa Hodomarsky.
Thank you, Isabel. Max Klinger's psychologically intense A Glove series presents a compelling transition to Jacob Lawrence's equally psychologically intense, yet truth-based 22 screen print series that illustrates the biography of the fervent 19th century American abolitionist John Brown. And you see it here on the far wall, all 22 framed objects. Dating to 1977, this print series replicates quite faithfully a series of gouaches that Lawrence had made over 3 decades earlier in 1941. It is indisputably one of the most important contributions of the artist's career. Jacob Lawrence grew up in Harlem and trained at the Harlem Art Workshop. He is acknowledged as one of the most preeminent and influential artists of his generation, whose most powerful contributions were the works he made in narrative series, beginning in 1938 at the age of 21, with the illustrated suite, The Life of Toussaint Louverture, a famous Haitian liberator, that was followed by other series illustrating other major events in Black history, including The Life of Frederick Douglass of 1939, The Life of Harriet Tubman of 1940, The Migration of the Negro of 1941, and The Life of John Brown, also of 1941. John Brown, who lived from 1800 to 1859, has become one of America's legendary heroes. Almost every child in the US has at least heard of the Civil War tune, John Brown's Body, with its refrain, "But his soul goes marching on." Most famously, in 1855 through 56, John Brown led an army, led anti-slavery forces in the struggle to keep the territory of Kansas a free state. His attack on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry on October 16, 1859, and his death by hanging on charges of treason on December 2nd of that year have come down in history as two of the critical events leading up to the American Civil War. Brown's martyrdom in the cause of anti-slavery has become an inspiration for many artists, writers, and poets to this day. Next slide, please. So here in the first 4 images of Lawrence's series, emphasis is placed on Brown's early dedication to the anti-slavery cause. Next slide. The 5th through the 8th images show the gradual evolution of Brown's plan to hide armed forces somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia or Tennessee and to launch guerrilla attacks to free slaves on local plantations. Next slide, please. Images 9 through 12 illustrate the fierce battles and devastation during a period of which has become known as Bleeding Kansas. Next slide. In the final images, the story intensifies as Brown continues his efforts to support an army of liberation and to assemble the munitions necessary to win his cause. Next slide. The series ends in the climactic raid on Harper's Ferry Armory in West Virginia in October of 1859. Next slide. And ultimately to Brown's capture, conviction, and hanging 2 months later. Next slide. In this series, Lawrence displays his expert ability to tell a story with pictures. The series begins with a depiction of Christ on the cross and ends with John Brown hanging from a noose. Images of martyrdom that neatly bookend the suite and conceptually link the two figures as saviors. Next slide. The series also shows Lawrence's mastery as a colorist. Here we see his ability to exploit the perceptual and emotional power of color to convey meaning. Note, for example, his repetitions of images of daggers, swords, bullets, and nails, usually pictured in gold. Next slide, please. And their juxtaposition with images of a crucifix, consistently pictured in black, until the second to the last image, in which John Brown, awaiting his hanging, clutches a symbolically red cross. Lawrence chose the medium of screen print, also known as silkscreen, as a medium capable of replicating the vibrant colors of the artist's original 1941 gouaches. The productions of the screen prints was complex. Each of the 22 images contained between at least 20 to 25 colors, each printed separately. The shapes that make up the images were hand-cut films, and a single screen was used for all of the colors in each print. Sewell Silman of the renowned Ives Silman screen printing press mixed all of the inks and determined the sequence in which the colors needed to be printed. As is the case with all multicolored print productions, the sequence was not determined by the size and placement of a particular shape, but by the transparency of the colors and the desired buildup of overprinted inks in the final prints. Next slide, please. We'll now segue to Ellen Gallagher's nonlinear 60-component suite of 2004 through 5, titled Deluxe, arguably the most ambitious and groundbreaking print production of the last half century or more, a composite object that expands our conception of the traditional print suite. All 60 prints that comprise Deluxe used as their conceptual springboard advertisements for magazines produced for Black audiences, magazines such as Sepia, Our World, Ebony, Jet, and specifically those produced between the 1930s and mid-1970s. Spanning in date from the new Negro constructions of the Harlem Renaissance to the Black Pride movement, this period of American history witnessed, as Gallagher describes it, a codification of race in America, and also a codification of gender roles, a specific period when advertisements in popular magazines more aggressively moved to set standards of beauty and comportment for both men and women, what to wear, how to appear, what is and is not attractive or cool. Next slide, please. The pages that Gallagher has chosen as her source material are often edgy advertisements for such products as wigs, as you see here. Next slide, please. Hair pomades at left and skin bleaching creams at right that promise Black Americans ways in which to, as Gallagher describes, quote, end quote, improve their appearance, often products that promise the freedom of white Europeanized beauty. As I think these few examples have reveal, Gallagher's Deluxe operates in the liminal spaces between, as she sees it, destruction and creation, excavation and protrusion, the serious and the humorous, desire and revulsion, beauty and the grotesque, all held in constant and interactive tension. Next slide, please. Production of each of the 60 prints utilized multiple copper plates and complex tools, such as a CO2 laser shown here on the right, capable of, next slide, please. Capable of exactly replicating Ellen's intentional cuts, which she had produced on a preliminary maquette, to the precise depths of her collaged layers of Gombe papers. So here on the left is a close-up of So Fun, one of the prints in the series. And as you can see, these exactly reproducible cuts to the various depths of the 4 layers of Gombe. And you can also see how the woman's hair is finished off with an application of hair pomade, beautifully sculpted, like so many of the other materials in the suite, a completely non-traditional, certainly hair pomade is non-traditional addition to a paper support. Other non-traditional intaglio techniques, such as a tattoo machine, were also used, as here on the right, for the lips and googly eyes at the bottom of So Fun. And below in this, you see Ellen working with a tattoo machine on a copper plate. And I should just say, as used here, the tattoo engraver is basically a mechanical form of dry point. You recall the Rembrandts and Boslitzes that Freda introduced. Dry point, a direct process by which Ellen incises into the copper plate directly, which simultaneously creates a burr of upturned copper yielding the velvety effect of those lips that you see above. Next slide, please. Here in Ice or Salt, a grid of 16 bewigged models appear with textual descriptions of the style of wig they wear. The original wigs, however, have been replaced by clear polymer dews, helmet-like and Baroque. As I hope you have already noted, in most of these pages, Gallagher is careful to excise or collage over the model's eyes, as well as to carefully scratch out their names, if and when they appear, so as to protect the individual's privacy. So the deluxe suite very much engages issues of identity, anonymity in the case of the wig and pomade models, but also of fame. Next slide, please. As it includes images of more well-known figures. Although their eyes too are often obscured, we can readily recognize such figures as, on the left, Captain Lloyd Seeley, the first Black officer to graduate from the FBI National Academy, and the first NYPD officer to rise to the role of commander. And on the right, actor Isaac Hayes. Next slide. Freda, would you like to take it from here?
Sure, absolutely. Wonderful. So if people would like to add questions to the Q&A, that would be great. I will start off our discussion by asking a question about Lisa, just about the last work we saw, the Gallagher. I'm wondering, when in her career did she make this suite, and are her other works similar, or does she work across media and this is sort of a unique object within her output, or is this something that is her regular practice?
Yeah, well, this is actually kind of I mean, she's gone on to very different imagery, but this is very much a part of her practice, engaging history. She does work across media. She works in painting, installation, print, drawing. I should say this suite does date to the mid like 2004, 2005. It very much took over the print studio of Two Palms when they were still relatively in their nascency, although they're an incredibly well-known print studio today. It began as a very small venture and then turned into this like mega production that took over 2 years to produce. David Lasry, who is the director of Two Palms, the owner of Two Palms, called it the War Room. And the work was incredible, and just visiting there in the mid 2000s and watching these works go up, tacked to the wall, it was really an unbelievable process. And yeah, I mean, it really is the most magnificent print production in a really, really long time. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does. It does. Just to shift, Isabel, there's a question about how you chose those 4 objects from Elle to exhibit. And also if you could talk a little bit about the intended audience for those suite of prints and what they might be.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm going to go back so we can see those 4 specifically. But yeah, so we chose these 4 prints out of a series of 10. I mean, when we were sort of coming together with this particular series within the rotation, it was actually one that we added later in the process. We started by adding sort of a lot of the other series and rearranging. And when we were looking at kind of the space generally, we realized we needed to add another series into the rotation for a very specific kind of constrained wall. And so we decided to add 4 works from this series as opposed to the full 10. You know, when making that kind of choice with this series, as opposed to something like the Jacob Lawrence series or the Klinger series, where it's really important to have every single element of the narrative be shown in order to understand the whole series, With this one, because it's so episodic and you're getting these kind of smaller glimpses into different portions of these women's lives, you can still understand the general idea behind the work with only 4 of them. Also, another sort of piece of this decision was that several of these works are sort of very delicate. There's kind of a very spare execution with them. And so when they're up on the wall, sometimes they don't necessarily transfer sort of visually as strongly as these 4 that we selected, which are kind of the more colorful pieces in the series. And kind of tying to your second part of the question, most of these would have kind of been held individually by collectors. They probably would not have been exhibited kind of on the wall in this format. And so those very kind of delicate compositions would have worked, kind of like what you were saying with the Rembrandt, and that there's this kind of intimacy. And they were intended mostly for private collectors. I think a lot of the private collectors, again, it was sort of this commercial failure when it first was published, and did not have the success that I think the publisher was expecting of it, but it was sort of supposed to be sold in these full sets. That actually didn't happen, and a lot of the sets were split up amongst sort of different collectors would buy 1 or 2 or 3 of them. And so that's kind of, rare that we have a full set of these because of that practice of sort of disseminating these separately outside of the general series.
Great. Talking about, I think, the ephemeral nature of paper and handling and the object. Dawn in the Q&A asked, Jacob Lawrence's migration series was broken up across museums, lost and found. She believes in the garbage in New York. I think she's talking about the gouaches. What's the ownership history of our series?
Interestingly enough, our series came directly from the printer. It was Sewell Silman's Printer's Proof that came to us through his family, his descendants, when they decided to sell it. So people think of Printer's Proofs, and actually I should say the Ellen Gallagher's are also Printer's Proof. From the master printer at Two Palms, Craig Zamiello. So people think of Printer's Proofs as being lesser, but actually, printers always protect themselves and get the choicest objects. So we are really, really fortunate to have such amazing quality series for these 2 works.
And just to follow up to that, the Jacob Lawrence series, was it done, what context was it made for? Did he produce it just for the broad market? Was there a patron? Was there a celebration year?
Yeah, so the story behind that is that, Detroit, when they acquired the 1941 gouache series, that, both during and after World War II, traveled widely across the US. And because they were gouaches and because they were not really well bound, they started to flake and had enormous condition issues, and they still do. And actually, I don't even think Detroit even travels them anymore because they're so very fragile. So by the 1970s, when this screen print series, which was produced, that there was actually a demand across the country for this series, and because they could not travel them anymore, Lawrence was convinced that something had to be done to reproduce them in a really beautiful graphic way, and chose Ives Silman and created this series.
Great. We have a question from Alyssa Waters, our former fellow. Thank you all so much. Great to see you. I was wondering if you could talk a little about the different ways in which narrative plays out in sets and series. So maybe, Isabel, you want to start off about talking about 2 different kinds of narratives, an imagined narrative, and then perhaps, an actual narrative, literary narrative, or something that has a source.
Yeah, sure. So going back to, well, so L is sort of a string. I don't know if I would necessarily classify it's not really a narrative in the traditional sense, because of the way that it takes this very sort of episodic presentation, and that's sort of where the time of one day comes in to structure it, because it doesn't follow sort of one individual's journey throughout the day in more of a traditional sort of narrative sense. But with Klinger, again, sort of episodic, but the unifying sort of narrative thread through this would be the figure of the glove itself, and that kind of becomes the protagonist of this story. Klinger was actually sort of, he had this moment of success when he first exhibited this, but then sort of fell out of favor throughout the early kind of 20th century within art history, because he was sort of talked about as a literary artist, which sort of fell out of favor with the advent of kind of modernism and Picasso, Matisse, and that sort of strand being picked up as kind of most revolutionary. And so Klinger really kind of celebrated his sort of dedication to this idea of a cycle, an idea of a narrative. And I think his choice also to include those one-word titles and sort of really think about the play between the word and the image, sort of really puts him closer to a kind of traditional sort of literary presentation. I will say we did also kind of steer away from like overt literary references within this rotation. That might be something we pick up in a later rotation. So I think, in this, we wanted to include narrative, but we wanted to sort of step away from some of the works in our collection, which deal more explicitly with literature and sort of poetry and things like that.
Great. Lisa, you were speaking of printer's proofs, and if you could just explain to the general audience what a printer's proof is and why they had been considered inferior, and why we now prize them so much.
So I actually misspoke. They're not considered inferior, but in terms of printer's proofs. So at print shops, it's typical for a master printer to get one copy of anything that he or she produces for that printer's personal collection. That's just pro forma. It's been that way for many, many years. And it's just sort of by way of thank you, but also by way of relationship with that particular artist, and the dialogue that happens within the print studio among printer and artist, and how integral the printer is to that production. I should not have sort of said that they were lesser. They just are not part of the kind of like sanctioned edition, but they are just as high quality, and they are pulled at the same time, and all of the above.
And I think now even more so when we're interested in sort of the special role that publishers and master printmakers play in producing prints. We actually highly prize artist proofs, printers proofs, as sort of the first pulls from the printer. So someone is curious about how having a more permanent display space for prints and drawings transforms the engagement with classes and the public, and what our future rotations are going to be and what we can look forward to. And I can answer a little bit of that and then sort of pass it on. We feel really excited about having a new exhibition space. It transforms everything we do, because it just enlivens the collection, and it gives not only us the opportunity to dig deep into it, but it gives our audiences sort of surprises and new things to think about. Not only our students and professors who come through, but also our broad audiences. You turn a corner, you see something you've never seen before. We have such a large collection. A lot of it is in Solander boxes, because paper is very affected by light. And so it's a great opportunity for us to get out sort of the broad range of our collection and sort of dig into the areas where we really have strengths. It's also a great opportunity for us to work with our students, our interns and fellows, to think about new ideas and different frameworks. Our next rotation is going to focus on our minimalism collection, and we have such a vast and rich collection here. And we're working with our Selden Fellows and our graduate curatorial interns. And we're just getting new voices and new perspectives and trying then to sort of broaden our own collection so that we can see where we have absences that we need to fill in. So we're very excited. Lisa, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, that was great. I do also want to say that, you know, we haven't had a permanent collection gallery in 20 years, and this is such a wonderful opportunity to show off acquisitions, to show off new purchases, new gifts from incredible donors who've been so loyal to the department. It's also a great opportunity, and you know, I know that Freda will follow up with this, but it's a great opportunity to well, this particular installation will be on view all fall semester. So this is also a great opportunity to interact with faculty. I should say that, you know, it's really wonderful to be able to offer faculty up a list of what's going to be on view so that they can include it in their teaching in vibrant ways. And we're really, really happy that this will remain on view through the fall semester for that very reason.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it gives our department the opportunity not only to react to what people want to come see in the study room, but for us to present what we think is important that might spur others to investigate different avenues of thought. Sorry, Isma.
And I would also add too that the proximity of the gallery to our study room is a really wonderful opportunity to create these kinds of hybrid visits for our sort of all of the classes and visitors that come, who are able to perhaps see specific holdings in the collection that they want to see in the study room, but then also move very organically through into the gallery space and see how these works actually operate within a gallery context, how we hang them. I always get a lot of questions about that when I have classes as sort of, you know, how would you actually put some of this stuff on the wall? And this really has already provided an opportunity for me to speak to students about kind of curatorial practices and the process of putting together these rotations. But they can also do that in conjunction with the, you know, regular kinds of gallery class visits that we offer in the study room.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, as Freda said at the very beginning of this talk, you know, we really do envisage this space as sort of a spilling out of what we do within the study room proper. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that goes for, you know, we are constantly surrounded by our art in the prints and drawings department, which is a wonderful feeling, and to be able to share that is really exciting. Catherine asked, what are the cans on the pedestal? So we can say something about them because they're great. So Lisa, do you want to talk about the cans?
They're fabulous. They're Enrique Chagoya's, it's called the Enlightened Savage, and they're Campbell soup cans, which is kind of like obviously a nod to Warhol, but they're each inscribed. I envision you should look it up. It's they were printed by Electric Works in California. Enrique Chagoya is the artist, and each one they're kind of a jab at art world politics, and from collectors to curators to directors to all of what we do, and they're quite fun and really, really super clever. And Chagoya is amazing, and look it up online. They're pretty wonderful.
Or come in the gallery and see them.
Or come visit, please.
This is not because I wanted, but somebody asked if we could go back to the Rembrandt and Baselitz prints, if we can look at the Baselitz series of the images, the compositions turned on their head, I think, because
yeah,
it takes a little bit of looking. Yes.
I wanted to just interject. I loved this juxtaposition, and especially in the in the age of surviving a pandemic, I was really intrigued by the right side up with the Rembrandts, and then the world observed on its head with the Baselitz. I just thought that was just sort of an amazing juxtaposition. And
Baselitz is still very interested in, he collects Old Master art, and he has a huge collection. His interests vary from period of his life to different periods, chiaroscuro woodcuts, Mannerist engravings. He has never collected Rembrandt, but obviously is a very well-educated artist in the history of art. And what I find so fascinating about this world upside down is that it is, I think, originally from the Bible and then continues as a Renaissance trope and is very much true today, has relevance for all of us in new ways. It just constantly evolves how we think about things. Hold on. Pleasing to note the similar abstract expressive color qualities of the work of Toulouse-Lautrec and Lawrence. So I think we wanted to show that works on paper are both black and white and in color. So if we go back to the sort of introductory image, we can see that we wanted to juxtapose black and white images with color images to sort of enliven the space and to see this wonderful composite print by, and I'm forgetting his name right now, Lisa, what's his name? The South African artist.
William Kentridge.
William Kentridge, which we literally got to install onto the wall using push pins. So that was like a really
Fred and I put that one up.
Exactly. Do you have any questions for each other, or?
A quick question for Lisa. The Gallagher series, the order of all of the prints, is that a prescribed order? Like, go back to the image here, but is that a prescribed order by Gallagher herself, or is that something that you designed?
You know, that's her prescribed order. It took shape while, as I said, in the war room, you know, while the prints were being produced. You know, she was sort of like moving them around with push pins on the wall, you know, figuring out how she wanted to order it. There's also something really wonderful about it because, as I said, you know, they're based on these pages from magazines that were produced between the 30s and the 70s. And you'll remember with earlier magazines, most of the pages were black and white versus color, and there would be pops of color throughout a magazine. But she also kind of wanted it to read in that way, so that there would be, you know, bright color, but then very muted color or plain black and white. She wanted it to read that way, of that mid-century way on the wall. So that was important to her. But yes, this is her order.
A different question for you, Isabel. The drawings that you talked about, the ink drawings by Klinger for the glove series, do they still exist?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to. Yeah, I'm not sure if they do. I can look it up, or if whoever asked wants to look it up. Yeah, I'm not sure if they still exist. It exists in, you know, several different editions. You might have noticed on the screen it was printed in 1881, and then our edition is from 1898. So he had, I think, 5 different editions that he created that are now kind of how people know this series. But I'm not sure about the current status of the drawings.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I just want to say thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. And we want to welcome you to our galleries to see set series and composite prints, which will be up through, I think, December. And then our next rotation will be on minimalism. As I said, it will be in a slightly different space because the 4th floor of Kahn will be hosting the Yale Center for British Art, some of their works, but it's going to be in sort of a bright open space that I think fits very appropriately minimalism. We're just very excited. And if you guys have questions or want to come look at prints, you can always make an appointment in the study room or come by the gallery. Thank you.